In 1930, 12-year-old Samuel Allen stole an apple. 18 deputies beat him unconscious for it. The sheriff laughed. The judge said there was no case.
The Tennessee slaughter of 1930. Granny Allen hunted 18 deputies who beat her. 12-year-old grandson. The bloodiest act of vengeance against local authority in Tennessee history and the most devastating campaign of retribution the Cumberland Mountains had ever witnessed from a grandmother defending her family's honor. This is the true story of Granny Allen. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Scott County, Tennessee, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely independent corners of the state. The Cumberland Plateau rises here in ancient majesty, its ridges and hollows sheltering families who had sought refuge from the outside world for generations. The people who settled these mountains came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit through decades of conflict with authorities who never understood that these hills had their own laws, their own justice, their own ways of handling matters that outsiders had no business involving themselves in. You see, in Scott County in 1930, the bonds between generations were sacred, the protection of children was paramount, and any attack on the young was an attack on the entire family. The mountain people had developed over centuries a code that governed their interactions, a system of understood rules that determined how disputes were settled, how wrongs were made right, how the vulnerable were protected. This code existed outside the official legal system and in many ways was more effective at maintaining the social order than anything the county sheriff could impose. The conflict between local law enforcement and the mountain communities had been simmering for decades by the time our story begins. The Depression had struck the region hard, driving families deeper into poverty and desperation, making the moonshine trade more important than ever as a source of cash income. The sheriffs and deputies who were tasked with enforcing prohibition often came from the lowland towns, men who viewed the highland people with contempt and who saw in their poverty an excuse for brutality. The enforcement they brought was heavy-handed, designed to demonstrate dominance rather than to achieve justice. The woman who would become known throughout Tennessee simply as Granny Allen was born Cordelia May Hutchins in 1866 in a cabin on the banks of Brimstone Creek that her grandfather had built with his own hands before the Civil War. She was the third of 9 children, born into a family that had worked this land since the first settlers arrived, that had fought in every American war, that had buried 5 generations in the small cemetery on the ridge above the home place. The fierce protectiveness that defined her character was evident from childhood, a willingness to defend those she loved that would later prove capable of things no one could have imagined. That's right, Cordelia Hutchins had grown up in a world where family was everything, where the bonds between generations were unbreakable, where the protection of the young was the highest duty any adult could fulfill. She had learned early that the world was dangerous, that children needed defenders, that a woman's role in mountain society included the fierce guardianship of those who could not protect themselves. These lessons shaped everything she would later become. Her childhood had been marked by the rhythms of farm life, the endless cycle of planting and harvesting that sustained families who lived close to the land. She had learned to work from the time she could walk, had absorbed the understanding that survival required effort, that nothing was given freely, that strength came in many forms and was not limited to physical power. She developed early the iron will that mountain life required, a determination that would sustain her through tragedies that would have broken weaker spirits. Her education had been practical rather than academic, focused on the knowledge that mountain life required. She learned to read well enough to study the Bible, to do arithmetic sufficient for household management, to absorb the basic learning that the one-room schoolhouse could provide. But her real education came from her mother and grandmothers, who taught her the skills of healing and nurturing, the arts of keeping a family alive through hard winters and harder times. Her marriage to a man named Ezekiel Allen in 1884 had been a love match that united 2 respected families in the Brimstone Creek community. Ezekiel was a farmer and occasional moonshiner, a quiet man who worked hard and asked nothing from the world except to be left in peace. Together they built a life on land that Cordelia's father had given them, raising crops and children and grandchildren with the devotion that mountain families brought to everything they did. The children came steadily through the years that followed, 8 of them in all, 5 boys and 3 girls. The Allen homestead became a prosperous place by mountain standards, the combined efforts of parents and children producing results that their neighbors acknowledged with respect. Ezekiel died in 1922, taken by pneumonia during a hard winter, leaving Cordelia a widow at 56 with grown children who had established their own households throughout the Hollow. By 1930, Cordelia Allen was 64 years old, known throughout Scott County as Granny Allen, a title of respect that acknowledged her status as matriarch of the extended Allen clan. She stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, her hair completely white, her face lined with the evidence of 6 decades of mountain life. Nothing about her appearance suggested the capacity for violence that would later make her name infamous throughout the region. She looked like what she was, an elderly grandmother who had devoted her life to caring for her family. The grandchildren were her greatest joy in those years after Ezekiel's death, the next generation of Allens who carried on the family name and the family traditions. There were 17 of them by 1930, ranging in age from infants to young adults, and Granny Allen loved each one with a fierce devotion that was evident to everyone who knew her. But her special favorite, the one who held the largest piece of her heart, was a 12-year-old boy named Samuel, the son of her youngest son, Thomas. Samuel Allen was a bright and curious child, with his grandmother's grey eyes and his father's quick mind, a boy who asked questions about everything and who absorbed knowledge like the mountain soil absorbed rain. He spent more time at Granny Allen's cabin than at his own home, drawn by her stories and her wisdom and the unconditional love she offered. He helped her with chores, listened to her tales of the old days, learned the mountain lore that she was determined to pass on before she died. Now, to understand what happened on the morning of June 12, 1930, you need to understand the particular circumstances that had made the Allen family targets for the county sheriff's attention. That's right. A new sheriff had been elected in Scott County, a man named Buford Hensley, who had campaigned on promises to eliminate moonshining and who had assembled a force of deputies notable for their willingness to use violence. Hensley was 45 years old, a lowland man who had no understanding of mountain ways and who viewed the Highland people as criminals to be subdued rather than citizens to be served. The Allen family's moonshine operation had attracted Hensley's attention within weeks of his taking office. Thomas Allen, Samuel's father, ran a still in the hollow above Brimstone Creek, producing whiskey that was known throughout the region for its quality. An informant had provided the location, and Hensley had decided to make an example of the Allens, to demonstrate that no family, regardless of their reputation, was beyond the reach of his authority. The raid was planned for a Thursday morning in mid-June, when the sheriff expected to catch Thomas at the still with evidence that would ensure conviction. What Hensley did not know, and what would later become central to everything that followed, was that Thomas had been warned and had hidden the operation the night before. When the deputies arrived, they found nothing illegal, no still, no whiskey, no evidence of the crime they had come to prosecute. And that's when the nightmare began to unfold. You see, the morning of June 12, 1930, had started like any other summer day on Brimstone Creek. Samuel had risen early and walked to his grandmother's cabin to help with the morning chores, a routine he followed several times each week. He was feeding the chickens when the sound of horses announced the arrival of the deputies, 18 men who surrounded the property with weapons drawn, expecting to find moonshiners at work. The deputies searched the property for over an hour, finding nothing, growing increasingly frustrated as their expected triumph turned to embarrassment. Sheriff Hensley was furious, understanding that his carefully planned raid had failed, that the informant's intelligence had been compromised, that he would return to town empty-handed. His anger needed an outlet, and he found one in the 12-year-old boy who was watching the search with undisguised contempt. Samuel had not hidden his feelings about the deputies, had made comments that the men overheard, had displayed the mountain pride that his grandmother had taught him. When Hensley demanded to know where the still was hidden, Samuel responded with words that would seal his fate. "Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell a lowland dog like you." What happened next would be remembered in Scott County for generations. Sheriff Hensley ordered his deputies to teach the boy a lesson about respecting the law. 4 of them grabbed Samuel, held him spread-eagled between them, while Hensley himself administered a beating that went far beyond any conceivable discipline. He used his fists at first, then his belt, then a stick that one of the deputies handed him. He beat the 12-year-old for nearly 20 minutes, pausing only when his arm grew tired, resuming when he had caught his breath. The other deputies watched and laughed, made comments about mountain brats learning their place, suggested additional punishments that even Hensley was not willing to administer. They held Samuel in position throughout the beating, adjusting their grip when he struggled, ensuring that he could not escape or defend himself. The boy's screams echoed through the hollow, heard by neighbors who were too frightened to intervene, heard by Granny Allen in her cabin just 100 yards away. Granny Allen emerged from her cabin when she heard Samuel's screams, moved toward the sound as quickly as her aged legs could carry her. Arrived to find her grandson being beaten by a man twice his size, while other men held him helpless. She screamed at them to stop, tried to reach Samuel, was pushed back by deputies who laughed at her efforts. She was forced to watch as the beating continued, forced to hear Samuel's cries for help that she could not provide, forced to witness the destruction of a child she loved more than her own life. When Hensley finally stopped, Samuel was barely conscious, his face swollen beyond recognition, his body covered with welts and bruises that would take weeks to heal. The deputies dropped him in the dirt, made final comments about what happened to families who defied the law, mounted their horses and rode away without looking back. Granny Allen gathered her grandson in her arms, carried him to her cabin, began the long process of caring for injuries that no child should ever have to suffer. The aftermath of the beating was devastating in ways that extended beyond the physical wounds. Samuel recovered slowly, his body healing over weeks of careful nursing, but something in him had been broken that could not be mended with poultices and prayers. The bright, curious child who had asked questions about everything became withdrawn and fearful, flinching at loud noises, refusing to leave his grandmother's cabin, waking screaming from nightmares that repeated the trauma over and over. The community's response to what had happened was outrage tempered by fear. Everyone knew that the beating had been unjustified, that Samuel had committed no crime, that Hensley had used a child to vent his frustration at a failed raid. But the sheriff controlled the law in Scott County, had demonstrated his willingness to use violence against anyone who opposed him, had made clear that complaints would be met with retaliation. The official channels that should have provided remedy were closed, controlled by the same political machine that had elected Hensley. And that's when Granny Allen made the decision that would define the rest of her life. You see, the beating of Samuel Allen had awakened something in Cordelia Allen that had lain dormant for 64 years. The fierce protectiveness that had always characterized her, the willingness to defend those she loved regardless of cost, transformed into something harder and more dangerous. She had watched her grandson being beaten and had been powerless to stop it. She had seen the men who hurt him ride away laughing. She had nursed his broken body and watched his broken spirit, and understood that something had to be done. She would kill them. Every deputy who had participated in the beating, every man who had held Samuel or watched while he was hurt, she would hunt them as they had hunted her family, would find them and kill them, would not rest until the debt was paid in full. 18 deputies had come to her property that morning. 18 deputies would die before she was finished. The planning process took 3 months, during which Granny Allen maintained the appearance of an elderly woman consumed by grief and fear. She attended church, accepted condolences from neighbors who understood what had happened, seemed to withdraw into the depression that everyone expected. Her sons worried about her, tried to draw her out, suggested that time would heal the wound that Samuel's beating had left. She listened to their concerns and said nothing, understanding that what she intended must remain hidden until the time came to act. The intelligence she gathered was comprehensive and methodical. She learned the habits of every deputy who had participated in the beating, their names obtained through careful questioning, their routines studied through patient observation. She identified where each man lived, when each traveled alone, when each would be most vulnerable. The network of information that mountain women maintained, the gossip and news that flowed through church gatherings and quilting circles, became her source of intelligence for planning murder. The weapons she acquired came from family members who understood what she intended and who offered their support without being asked. Her sons provided rifles and pistols, ammunition and supplies, asking no questions about why their elderly mother suddenly needed such things. The mountain community closed around her, protecting her plans with the same silence they would later maintain when investigators came asking questions. Her first kill came in September 1930, 3 months after Samuel's beating. The target was a young deputy named William Crawford, who had been one of those holding Samuel during the beating, who had laughed loudest at the boy's screams. Crawford was found shot dead on a road outside Huntsville, killed by a single rifle shot that demonstrated remarkable marksmanship for a 64-year-old woman. No witnesses, no evidence, no suspect identified. The killing was attributed to the general lawlessness of the region, assumed to be the result of some personal dispute unrelated to Crawford's work as a deputy. No one connected the death to the elderly grandmother whose grandson had been beaten 3 months before. No one imagined that a woman of Granny Allen's age could be capable of such calculated violence. The assumption of harmlessness was her greatest asset, and she would exploit it throughout her campaign. The second killing came 3 weeks later, targeting another deputy who had participated in the beating. This man, named James Patterson, was found shot dead in his home outside Oneida, killed through a window while he ate his supper. The method was similar to the first killing, the marksmanship equally impressive, the victim equally connected to the events of June 12th. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession in October, demonstrating that Granny Allen's campaign was accelerating. The victims were both deputies from the Hensley force, both killed with the precision that had characterized the earlier deaths. The sheriff's department began to realize that something unusual was happening, that their members were being targeted by someone with knowledge of their identities and movements. That's right. Granny Allen continued her campaign through the fall and winter of 1930-1931, striking with a regularity that kept her enemies constantly off balance. The fifth deputy died in November, found floating in the Big South Fork with a bullet wound in his back. He had been fishing alone, confident that he was safe in a spot miles from any Allen property. Granny Allen had tracked him for weeks, had learned his habits, had waited for the perfect moment when no witnesses would be present. The sixth was ambushed on a mountain road in December, his body discovered in a ravine 2 days after he disappeared. He had been traveling between towns, had stopped to water his horse at a creek, had never seen the elderly woman who watched from the ridge above. The single shot struck him in the chest, killing him before he could understand what had happened. His horse was found wandering, saddlebags still attached. No sign of robbery to explain his death. The seventh and eighth died on the same night in January, killed in a coordinated attack that demonstrated capabilities no one had suspected the killer possessed. Both men had been among those holding Samuel during the beating. Both had laughed at the boy's screams. Granny Allen had recruited help for this double killing. Family members who shared her determination and who were willing to take risks to achieve justice for Samuel. The timing sent a message that everyone understood. The killer was not working alone, and no one involved in the beating was safe. The terror that spread through the remaining deputies was unlike anything they had experienced. These were men who had considered themselves powerful, who had used their badges to intimidate and brutalize with impunity. Now they were the ones being hunted, the ones who could not sleep for fear of what the night might bring, the ones who saw threats in every shadow and every stranger. Some began drinking heavily, trying to drown the fear that consumed them. Others became paranoid, suspecting everyone around them of being the killer or allied with the killer. Sheriff Hensley tried to maintain control, tried to project confidence that the killer would be caught, but his authority was crumbling. Deputies refused assignments that took them into the mountains alone. Patrols that had once been routine became exercises in terror, every sound potentially the last thing they would hear. The department that had brutalized Samuel Allen with such casual cruelty was discovering that cruelty had consequences they had never imagined. Each killing was executed with care that reflected Granny Allen's months of preparation. She knew the mountains better than any of the deputies she hunted, had walked these ridges and hollows for 6 decades, could move through terrain that the lowland men feared to enter. The skills of survival that every mountain woman possessed had been adapted to a deadlier purpose, and she proved devastatingly effective at this new application. The terror that Granny Allen created spread through the sheriff's department like a plague. Deputies who had participated in Samuel's beating began to request transfers, to claim illness, to find reasons why they could not continue serving. Some resigned their positions entirely, deciding that the modest salary was not worth dying for. Sheriff Hensley found it increasingly difficult to maintain his force, as word spread about what was happening to men who had been involved in the Allen raid. The investigation into the killings eventually recognized the pattern that connected them. A state investigator named Thomas Morrison was assigned to the case, and he quickly identified the common factor. All the victims had participated in the raid that had resulted in Samuel Allen's beating. Morrison began to suspect that someone was seeking revenge, though he found it difficult to imagine who might be responsible for such sustained violence. The surveillance of the Allen family began in December 1930, with investigators watching the movements of Thomas Allen and his brothers, assuming that one of them must be the killer. Granny Allen was largely ignored in this surveillance, her age and gender placing her beyond suspicion. The investigators watched her sons while she continued her campaign unimpeded, the assumption that women were incapable of such violence providing cover that no man could have enjoyed. The 9th killing came on the first anniversary of Samuel's beating, June 12, 1931. Granny Allen had saved this date for a special target, one of the deputies who had been most enthusiastic in his participation, who had suggested additional punishments that even Hensley had refused. The killing was more elaborate than the others, designed to send a message that the anniversary had significance, that the killer remembered exactly what had happened and intended to continue until justice was complete. The 10th and 11th killings followed in quick succession, each targeting deputies identified as active participants in the beating. The 12th came in August, the 13th in September, the 14th in October. By fall 1931, 14 of the 18 deputies were dead, and the remaining 4 had fled Scott County entirely, seeking safety in other states where they hoped the Mountain Avenger could not find them. But Granny Allen found them anyway, tracking them through networks of information that extended far beyond the county of her birth. The mountain people had relatives and connections throughout the region, and these networks carried news of where the fleeing deputies had gone. The 15th deputy died in Kentucky, shot through his boarding house window. The 16th was killed in North Carolina, ambushed on a road outside the town where he had sought refuge. The 17th died in Virginia, his body discovered in a field behind the farm where he had been hiding. The 18th and final killing came in December 1931, 18 months after Samuel's beating. The target was Sheriff Buford Hensley himself, the man who had administered the beating, who had used his fists and belt and stick on a 12-year-old boy while his deputies laughed and held the child helpless. Hensley had barricaded himself in his home in Huntsville, surrounded by the few men still willing to serve as deputies, convinced that he was safe behind walls and guards. He was wrong about that safety. Granny Allen reached him despite every precaution, found a way past defenses that would have stopped anyone less determined. She entered his home in the early hours of a winter morning, bypassed guards who had grown complacent after months of vigilance, reached the bedroom where Hensley slept with a pistol under his pillow. What passed between them in those final moments was never recorded, known only to Granny Allen and to the man she killed. When Hensley's body was found the next morning, the evidence suggested that his death had not been quick. He had been beaten, his face showing marks that suggested the same kind of systematic violence he had inflicted on Samuel. He had been shot multiple times, in places designed to cause pain rather than immediate death. The final bullet had come only after he had experienced something of what he had done to a 12-year-old boy, after he had known helplessness and terror and the understanding that no one would come to save him. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the campaign ended. Granny Allen was arrested 2 weeks after Hensley's death, identified by evidence found at the scene and by the pattern that connected all 18 killings to Samuel's beating. The case against her was built on circumstantial evidence, on witness testimony, on the obvious motive that her grandson's brutalization provided. She did not deny what she had done, seemed almost proud of it, faced her accusers with a dignity that belied her years. The trial of Cordelia Granny Allen became the most sensational criminal proceeding in Tennessee history, drawing national attention and spectators who traveled from across the country to witness the case. The courtroom was packed every day, with crowds gathering outside to follow updates from those fortunate enough to secure seats inside. Newspapers sent reporters from distant cities, making Granny Allen's story known to millions who had never heard of Scott County or Brimstone Creek. The atmosphere in Huntsville during the trial was electric with tension and expectation. Hotels were filled beyond capacity, with visitors sleeping in their automobiles or camping in fields outside town. Street vendors sold refreshments to the crowds, and local merchants reported their best business in years. The attention brought unwanted scrutiny to Scott County, with journalists investigating not just the killings, but the conditions that had produced them. The scene inside the courtroom was remarkable for its contrasts. The defendant was a small elderly woman with white hair and weathered skin, dressed in the plain black dress she had worn to church for decades. She sat quietly through testimony that described her killings in graphic detail, showed no reaction when witnesses identified her as the woman they had seen near crime scenes, maintained a composure that some found chilling and others found admirable. Her hands, folded in her lap, showed the calluses of a lifetime of hard work, seemed incapable of the violence the prosecution described. The spectators included journalists from across the nation, curious observers who had traveled hundreds of miles, and supporters from the mountain community who packed the galleries whenever space permitted. The latter group was notable for its size and its silence, their presence making a statement without words, their numbers demonstrating that Granny Allen was not alone. Many were elderly women like herself, grandmothers who understood viscerally what she had witnessed and what she had done in response. The prosecution presented its case methodically, connecting Granny Allen to the deaths through evidence that demonstrated planning and determination. They called forensic experts who analyzed bullet trajectories and matched weapons to wounds, who built a technical case that was impressive in its detail. The prosecutor, a state attorney named Charles Morrison brought in from Nashville, understood the difficulty of his position but pressed forward with professional determination. They portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered 18 men, most of them officers of the law, who had shown no mercy regardless of any circumstances. Morrison argued that the law must apply equally to everyone, that vigilante justice could not be tolerated regardless of the provocation, that Granny Allen's actions threatened the fabric of civilized society. He demanded the death penalty, arguing that the scope and brutality of her crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. But the trial became something more than a murder prosecution. The defense, led by a lawyer named William Mitchell, who had volunteered to take the case without fee, used the proceedings to put the Scott County Sheriff's Department on trial. He called witnesses who testified to the circumstances of Samuel's beating, to the brutality that had been inflicted on a 12-year-old boy, to the failure of any official body to investigate or punish those responsible. The testimony about Samuel's beating shocked the courtroom. Witnesses described the boy being held spread-eagled by 4 grown men, described the sheriff beating him with fists and belt and stick for nearly 20 minutes, described the screams that echoed through the hollow and the laughter of the deputies who watched. They described Granny Allen being pushed back when she tried to intervene, described her forced to watch helplessly, while her grandson was brutalized. Samuel himself was called to testify, now 13 years old, still bearing visible scars from the beating. His testimony was halting and painful, interrupted by tears that he tried unsuccessfully to suppress, marked by the trauma that had never fully healed. He described what had been done to him, described the nightmares that still plagued his sleep, described the grandmother, who had nursed him back to health and who had done what no one else would do to seek justice for what he had suffered. The photographs of Samuel taken after the beating were entered into evidence, showing a child whose face was swollen beyond recognition, whose body was covered with bruises and welts, whose injuries would have been excessive if inflicted on a grown criminal, and were monstrous when inflicted on a 12-year-old boy. The courtroom gasped when the photographs were displayed, and several jurors were seen wiping tears from their eyes. The defense attorney's closing argument focused not on denying what Granny Allen had done, but on explaining why she had done it. He described a grandmother who had watched her grandson beaten nearly to death by men who faced no accountability, who had seen him wake screaming from nightmares for months afterward, who had understood that the system that should have protected him had instead brutalized him. He asked the jury to consider what any grandmother would do when faced with such circumstances, whether any punishment the court could impose would be proportionate to what she had already suffered. The jury deliberated for 6 days, the longest deliberation in Tennessee legal history, suggesting that the decision was far from straightforward. When they finally returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the case and the community's sympathy for a grandmother who had defended her grandson, guilty of voluntary manslaughter on 18 counts, with a recommendation for the minimum possible sentence. The verdict was a repudiation of the system that had brutalized Samuel Allen and had protected those responsible. It acknowledged that while Granny Allen had committed terrible acts, the acts committed against her grandson were equally terrible and had received no official censure. The judge, a man named Robert Patterson, who had listened to testimony with evident emotion, sentenced Granny Allen to 18 concurrent terms of 3 years each, with eligibility for parole after 2 years. It was the most lenient sentence the law would allow. Granny Allen served 22 months at the Tennessee State Prison for Women before being released on parole in late 1933. She was 67 years old, had spent nearly 2 years in prison for seeking the justice that the legal system had denied her grandson. She returned to Scott County, to the mountains she had never wanted to leave, to Samuel and the rest of her family, who had waited for her throughout her imprisonment. The years following her release were quiet ones, marked by the rhythms of farm life that had always defined her existence. She lived in her cabin on Brimstone Creek, surrounded by family members who visited daily, helping to raise great-grandchildren who were born while she was in prison. The community accepted her back without judgment, understood that what she had done, however terrible, had grown from a love and an injustice that demanded response. Samuel gradually recovered from the trauma of his beating, helped by his grandmother's return, and by the knowledge that those who had hurt him had been punished. He grew into a young man who carried the scars of his childhood, but who was not defined by them, who married and had children of his own, who named his first daughter Cordelia in honor of the grandmother who had loved him enough to kill for him. Granny Allen never spoke publicly about her campaign, never granted interviews to the journalists who sought her out, never confirmed or denied the details that had emerged during her trial. The silence she maintained was complete, a refusal to revisit events that had consumed years of her life. When asked about those years, she would simply say that she had done what any grandmother would do, that the matter was closed. Her health remained surprisingly good for many years, the constitution that had sustained her through her campaign, and her imprisonment continuing to serve her. She worked in her garden when weather permitted, attended church every Sunday, maintained the independence that had always characterized her. The visits to Samuel's home continued until she could no longer make the walk, and then he would come to her, sitting with her on the porch and talking about the ordinary matters that filled the days of mountain families. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1948 at the age of 82. She had outlived everyone directly involved in Samuel's beating, had seen the end of Prohibition and the beginning and end of another world war, had watched her grandson grow into a man with a family of his own. She was buried in the family cemetery on the ridge above the home place, the stone that marked her grave bearing only her name and dates, no epitaph to summarize a life that defied simple summary. The aftermath of Granny Allen's campaign reshaped law enforcement practices in the Tennessee mountains for a generation. The exposure of what had been done to Samuel, which came out in devastating detail during the trial, generated public outrage that could not be ignored. Newspapers that had previously ignored or dismissed the concerns of mountain communities now published editorials demanding reform. Politicians who had supported men like Hensley found themselves facing questions they could not answer. Congressional representatives from Tennessee were forced to address the issue, receiving letters from constituents who demanded action. State legislators convened hearings that examined law enforcement practices across the mountain counties, hearing testimony that shocked even those who had suspected problems existed. The accumulated evidence created a picture of systematic abuse that could no longer be ignored or excused. Investigations were launched into sheriff's departments throughout the region, revealing patterns of abuse that extended far beyond Scott County. Other families came forward with stories of similar treatment, of deputies who had beaten and brutalized with impunity, of complaints that had been ignored or punished. The accumulated testimony created a picture of law enforcement that troubled even those who had supported aggressive methods. The reforms that followed were significant, though they came too late for Samuel and for the many other children who had suffered at the hands of brutal deputies. Procedures were established prohibiting the physical punishment of minors during enforcement actions, requiring documentation of any force used against suspects, mandating investigation of complaints about deputy conduct. Training programs were developed that emphasized the rights of citizens, even those accused of crimes, and the limits that officers must observe. The political consequences extended beyond law enforcement policy. The trial had exposed the corruption that allowed men like Hensley to hold power, the political machines that protected them from accountability, the failures of oversight that permitted abuse to flourish. Reformers used the Granny Allen case as evidence of what needed to change, and change slowly came to the mountain counties of Tennessee. The cultural impact extended beyond policy changes. The Granny Allen case became a symbol throughout Tennessee of what could happen when law enforcement forgot its proper role, when those charged with protecting citizens instead became their tormentors. Parents told their children the story as a warning about the abuse of power, as a reminder that authority could be corrupted, as an example of what ordinary citizens were capable of when pushed beyond endurance. The gravesite where Granny Allen rests became a place of pilgrimage for those who remembered the story, visited by people who wanted to pay respects to a grandmother who had refused to accept the brutalization of her grandson without response. The stone that marks her resting place is simple, weathered by decades of mountain weather, but the name carved into it remains legible. Flowers appear there regularly, left by visitors who have heard the story and want to acknowledge it. The songs that emerged from the Granny Allen story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, from the beating through the campaign to the trial. These songs celebrated her determination, described her killings in detail that bordered on admiration, portrayed her as a symbol of grandmotherly love pushed beyond all limits by an injustice too great to bear. The first songs appeared within weeks of the trial's conclusion, composed by local musicians who understood the story's significance to the mountain community. These early ballads were simple, built on traditional melodies with new words that told Granny Allen's story in terms that audiences would understand. They spread through the mountains by word of mouth, learned by one community and carried to the next, modified and embellished as they traveled until multiple versions existed throughout the region. One popular ballad described the beating of Samuel, painting a vivid picture of a 12-year-old boy being brutalized by grown men while his grandmother was forced to watch. The song opened with the peaceful morning, Samuel feeding chickens at his grandmother's cabin, innocent of any knowledge that violence was approaching. It described the deputies arriving, the failed search, the sheriff's growing fury at finding nothing. The verses captured the moment when Hensley's anger found its target in a child whose only offense had been speaking with the pride his grandmother had taught him. The song's description of the beating itself was vivid and terrible. It captured the four deputies holding Samuel spread-eagled, the sheriff's fists striking again and again, the belt and stick that followed when his hands grew tired. It described Samuel's screams, the laughter of the watching deputies, Granny Allen's attempts to intervene and her being pushed back by men who found her desperation amusing. The image became iconic, repeated in countless retellings, a symbol of what happens when power is exercised without restraint. The verses following the beating described Granny Allen's transformation from helpless witness to avenging fury. They captured the 3 months of planning, the patience that concealed rage, the preparations that no one suspected. The song portrayed her as patient and methodical, waiting until the time was right, then striking with a precision that demonstrated exactly what an elderly woman could accomplish when sufficiently motivated. Another song told the story from the perspective of the deputies, describing their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one around them. This song was darker than most, capturing the fear that must have consumed men who understood that death was hunting them, that nothing could protect them from the consequences of what they had done to a child. It described sleepless nights spent watching windows, every sound a potential warning. every stranger a potential killer. The song imagined their desperate attempts to flee, their belief that distance would provide safety, their dawning realization that Granny Allen would track them wherever they went. It portrayed the final moments of each deputy, the understanding that the elderly woman they had dismissed as harmless had become the most dangerous person they would ever encounter. The moral was unmistakable. Those who harm children may escape consequences for a time, but eventually the debt comes due. A third song focused on the relationship between grandmother and grandson, describing the love that had sustained them both through the ordeal and that would continue to sustain them after her release. This song was more tender than the others, avoiding the violence of the ballads in favor of a meditation on the bonds that connect generations, on the fierce protectiveness that grandmothers feel for their grandchildren, on the lengths to which love will go when it is forced to witness the destruction of innocence. A fourth song addressed Sheriff Hensley directly, condemning the man who had beaten a child and paid with his life. The verses described his brutality, his arrogance, his certainty that he was beyond consequences. They portrayed his attempts to hide after his deputies began dying, his barricades and guards, his final understanding that nothing could protect him from the grandmother whose grandson he had nearly killed. The song ended with his death, beaten as he had beaten Samuel, experiencing the helplessness he had inflicted on a child. The most famous of all the Granny Allen songs was composed several years after her death by a professional musician who traveled to Scott County to research the story. This comprehensive ballad told the complete narrative with skill and emotional power, becoming a standard in the Appalachian music repertoire. It has been recorded by numerous artists over the decades, carrying Granny Allen's story to audiences who never knew her name, but who recognized in her actions something universal about love and protection and justice. Historians who have studied the Granny Allen case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to corrupt authority, arguing that the sheriff's conduct during the beating justified whatever response it provoked. They note that the legal system had provided no remedy for Samuel's brutalization, that the official channels that should have punished Hensley were controlled by his political allies, that Granny Allen's campaign was the only form of accountability those responsible would ever face. These scholars have traced the roots of the case to the broader context of Depression-era law enforcement in rural America. The economic collapse had intensified conflicts between authorities and impoverished communities, had given sheriffs like Hensley both motive and opportunity to abuse their power. The mountain people were particularly vulnerable, their isolation and poverty making them easy targets for officials who faced no oversight and no consequences for their actions. The economic analysis reveals why moonshining remained so important to mountain families, even decades after Prohibition began. The Depression had devastated what little cash economy existed in the highlands, making the whiskey trade more essential than ever for families who needed money for taxes, medicine, and goods they could not produce themselves. The enforcement campaigns that targeted moonshiners were not merely law enforcement, but economic warfare against communities that had no other options. Others have focused on gender dynamics, observing that Granny Allen's success depended partly on assumptions about elderly women that made her invisible to investigators. No one suspected that a 64-year-old grandmother could be capable of killing 18 men over 18 months, and this assumption of harmlessness allowed her to operate with a freedom that would have been impossible for a younger or male perpetrator. Her campaign challenged expectations about who was capable of violence and for what reasons. Feminist scholars have examined Granny Allen's story as evidence of women's capacity for agency, even in patriarchal societies that denied them formal power. Denied access to courts and political processes, excluded from the official channels through which grievances might be addressed, she created her own form of justice through means that were available to her. Her campaign was not an abandonment of feminine values, but an expression of them. The protective grandmother extended to encompass the violent defense of her grandson's honor. The psychological analysis of Granny Allen's campaign has attracted scholarly attention. Researchers have examined how she was able to sustain her determination over 18 months of hunting, how she managed the psychological burden of killing 18 men while maintaining the appearance of normal life. The compartmentalization required was extraordinary, suggesting either remarkable psychological resilience or a transformation so complete that the woman who killed was fundamentally different from the woman who attended church. Still, others have examined the case as an example of how vigilante justice can emerge when official systems fail to protect the most vulnerable. The beating of Samuel Allen was witnessed by multiple people, was known throughout the community, was never investigated or punished by any official body. When the system designed to protect children instead brutalized them, when those charged with maintaining order instead became the source of violence, what options remained for those who loved the victims? Legal scholars have analyzed the jury's verdict as an example of jury nullification, the practice by which juries reject the strict application of law in favor of what they perceive as justice. The evidence against Granny Allen was overwhelming, the killings clearly premeditated, the legal definition of murder clearly satisfied. Yet the jury chose to convict on manslaughter rather than murder and recommended the minimum sentence. This verdict represented a community judgment that Granny Allen's actions, however illegal, were morally justified by the circumstances that had produced them. The sociological examination of the community's response reveals how thoroughly the mountain people supported Granny Allen's campaign. No one provided information to investigators, no one testified against her until the evidence made denial impossible. No one condemned what she had done, even when given opportunities to do so anonymously. This wall of silence reflected a collective judgment that Samuel's beating had been an attack on the entire community, that Granny Allen's response was not merely personal vengeance, but community defense. You see, what Granny Allen did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 18 men, most of them shot without warning, without any opportunity to surrender or defend themselves. The fact that her victims had participated in her grandson's beating does not eliminate the fact that she acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not hers to take. Any society that hopes to maintain order must condemn vigilante killing, regardless of the grievances that motivate it. And yet, her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. She was a grandmother whose 12-year-old grandson had been beaten nearly to death by the county sheriff, while 4 deputies held him helpless, whose attempts to intervene had been brushed aside, who had been forced to watch the brutalization of a child she loved more than her own life. The system that should have protected Samuel had instead brutalized him. The system that should have punished those responsible had instead protected them. What options did she have? What would any grandmother do when faced with such horror and such complete absence of justice? Her story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The beating of Samuel Allen was legal in the sense that no law explicitly prohibited it, that the sheriff faced no criminal charges for what he had done, that the official system treated the matter as closed. But the beating was not just. Samuel was a 12-year-old boy whose only offense had been speaking disrespectfully to men who were searching his family's property without finding what they sought. His punishment was not law enforcement, but brutality, not discipline, but revenge for wounded pride. The specific circumstances that produced the Granny Allen story, the combination of corrupt local politics, aggressive prohibition enforcement, and complete absence of oversight over law enforcement conduct, have not entirely disappeared. Similar abuses continue to occur, continue to generate similar responses, continue to raise the same questions about what citizens can do when those charged with protecting them become their tormentors. The reforms that followed Granny Allen's campaign addressed some of these problems, but the underlying tensions remain. The descendants of Granny Allen still live in those Tennessee mountains, carrying the memory of their ancestor through the generations. Family reunions include visits to the cemetery where she rests, moments of reflection on a life that encompassed both terrible suffering and terrible vengeance. The story is told to each new generation, ensuring that what happened will not be forgotten even as those who lived it pass away. The family maintains traditions that connect them to Granny Allen and to Samuel, preserving not just the story of the campaign, but the values that had shaped their ancestors' life. The importance of protecting children, the obligation to stand up for family, The understanding that love sometimes demands actions that the world cannot understand. These principles have been transmitted across the generations. Samuel himself lived into his 80s, passing away in 1998 surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who knew his story. He never forgot what his grandmother had done for him, never stopped honoring her memory, never ceased to feel the mixture of gratitude and grief that her sacrifice had created. His daughter Cordelia, named for the grandmother he had loved, became the keeper of the family history, ensuring that the story was passed on accurately and completely. The mountains of Scott County remain today, much as they were in Granny Allen's time, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollow where Samuel was beaten still shelters the descendants of families who witnessed what happened, who heard his screams, who later learned what his grandmother had done to avenge him. The cabin where Granny Allen lived and died has long since fallen to ruin, but the land remains in the family, worked by great-great-grandchildren who know the history and honor the memory. The community that surrounds the old Allen property has changed in many ways since 1930, connected now to the broader world through roads and communications that were impossible in Granny Allen's time. Young people leave for cities, seeking opportunities that the mountains cannot provide, and the population of the county has declined with each passing decade. The moonshining culture that once defined the region has largely faded, replaced by legal employment and government assistance that provide what whiskey money once provided. But the memory of what happened persists, kept alive by family members who continue to tell the story, who bring their children and grandchildren to visit the cemetery, who ensure that each new generation understands what Granny Allen did and why she did it. The story has become a kind of inheritance, passed down like the family Bible or the deeds to the land, a possession that cannot be measured in monetary terms, but that has value beyond calculation. The cemetery where Granny Allen rests sits on a hillside overlooking the hollow, surrounded by trees that have grown tall in the decades since her burial. The stones are weathered by nearly a century of mountain weather, but the names carved into them remain legible. Her stone is simple, marked only with her name and the years of her life. Nearby stands a stone for Ezekiel, the husband who died years before the tragedy that would define her legacy. Visitors leave flowers at her grave, tokens of respect for a grandmother who refused to accept the brutalization of her grandson without response. Some leave notes, expressions of admiration or sympathy, or simple acknowledgement that they have heard the story and been moved by it. These offerings are collected periodically by family members, stored in boxes that preserve the evidence of how widely the story has traveled, how many hearts it has touched. On the anniversary of Samuel's beating, June 12th, family members gather at the cemetery to remember what happened. They share stories about Granny Allen, the woman most of them never knew, keeping her memory alive through the telling. They share stories about Samuel, who lived into his 80s and who never forgot what his grandmother had done for him. They stand in silence for a moment, acknowledging the tragedy and the response that shaped everything that followed. The story of Granny Allen endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love, and what love becomes when it is forced to witness the destruction of innocence. It is the story of protection, and the lengths to which guardians will go when the system that should protect fails catastrophically. It is the story of justice, and what justice means when official channels offer no remedy for official crimes. It is, finally, a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Granny Allen stood, to see the cemetery where she rests, to walk the hollow where Samuel was beaten while she was forced to watch? Would you breathe the mountain air, feel the wind that has blown through these ridges for millennia, sense the presence of history that lingers in certain places? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the cemetery is difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from Knoxville takes several hours, winding through mountains that seem to rise higher with each passing mile. The pavement gives way to gravel in places, and the gravel gives way to dirt roads that require careful navigation. The isolation that once protected the mountain people from outside interference now makes their communities difficult to reach for those who wish to understand their history. But the difficulty of the journey is part of its meaning, a reminder that the people who lived here chose this land precisely because it was hard to reach. The community welcomes visitors who come with respect, who want to learn rather than judge, who understand that they are entering a place with deep history and strong traditions. The people who live here are proud of their heritage, proud of the ancestors who refused to accept the brutalization of their children, proud of the grandmother who demonstrated that mountain people would protect their own, regardless of the cost. They will share their stories if asked politely, will point the way to the cemetery, will help visitors understand the context that makes Granny Allen's story comprehensible. Standing at her grave, looking out over the mountains that she knew so well, one can almost feel her presence lingering in the wind that rustles through the trees. She is gone, of course, has been gone for decades now, but what she did remains, preserved in memory and in song, and in the lessons that her story teaches. The questions she forces us to ask about love and protection and the limits of what any grandmother should be expected to endure have no easy answers, which is perhaps why her story continues to resonate so deeply with all who hear it. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Granny Allen and Samuel close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. Her story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Scott County during those terrible years, as long as grandmothers love their grandchildren with a ferocity that defies law and logic, as long as systems fail and ordinary people find their own extraordinary ways to respond. She is gone now, dust mingling with the earth beside the husband and children she loved and lost. But what she did echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. The lessons of her story remain relevant even today. The tension between authority and the protection of children has not disappeared, and the question of what citizens can do when official systems fail the most vulnerable remains as urgent as ever. Granny Allen's answer, the taking of lives in response to the brutalization of her grandson, cannot be endorsed as a model for others to follow. But her story reminds us why such answers become possible, why the social contract can break down so completely that violence seems like the only remaining option. The descendants who carry her memory understand both the horror and the necessity of what she did. They do not celebrate violence, do not wish that circumstances had required their ancestor to become a killer, but they understand that she faced a choice that no grandmother should ever have to face, and they honor the love that drove her to make the choice she made. Her story has become part of their identity, a reminder of what their family is capable of when protecting its own. And that, my friend, is the true story of Granny Allen, who hunted 18 deputies after they beat her 12-year-old grandson Samuel while she was forced to watch helplessly on a summer morning in 1930 in Scott County, Tennessee. A story of love and devastating and terrible violence, of patience and righteous fury, of justice found where the law could not and would not and refused to ever provide it. A story that reminds us of the sacred bond between grandparents and grandchildren, of the fierce and unwavering protectiveness that the old feel for the young, of the terrible consequences that follow when that bond is violated by those who should know better. The mountains remember her name and her deeds and her courage and her ultimate sacrifice made in the sacred name of love, and through them, through the songs and stories that continue to be sung and told across these ancient and timeless Cumberland lands, so do we all, now and forever, unto eternity, as long as memory endures, and people gather to hear tales of mountain justice and family honor and sacred duty, and the lengths to which true love will go when forced to witness the destruction of innocence.